Welcome to a story of love that changed everything. A tale of two hearts finding their way to each other when they least expected it. The old cottage smelled of salt, lavender, and a century of secrets. Elara Vance breathed it all in, a complicated perfume of home and history she was still getting used to. For 3 weeks, she had lived within these walls, her grandmother's walls, and every day felt like turning a page in a book she had found halfway through. She had unpacked her life, or what was left of it, into the cozy rooms. Her books, hundreds of them, now lined the built-in shelves that flanked the stone fireplace. Her favourite teapot, a cheerful blue ceramic pot, sat on the stovetop, and the worn floral armchair was already moulded to the curve of her body. This move to Port Blossom was supposed to be an escape from the ghost of a relationship that had crumbled like old paper, from a city that felt too loud, too demanding, too full of memories of a man she had once thought she would marry. Here, the only demands were the rhythmic crash of waves on the shore 100 yards away, and the persistent cry of gulls wheeling in the pale sky. It was a quiet existence, a deliberate stepping away from the noise, and she craved it like a thirsty woman craved water. Her life in the city had been one of ordered precision. As a research librarian at a sprawling university, she had navigated labyrinths of information, finding solace in the quiet certainty of facts and recorded history. Her days were spent in the hushed reverence of the library's reading room. Her evenings were in an apartment that was minimalist and modern, a space she had shared with a man who appreciated its clean lines and lack of clutter. He was a man who, it turned out, also appreciated a lack of complication in his life, a complication she had apparently become. Now, her world was cluttered in the most wonderful way. Her grandmother's cottage was a museum of a life well lived. Seashells lined the windowsills, faded photographs of smiling strangers stood on the mantelpiece, and mismatched mugs hung from hooks in the kitchen. It was a space that held its memories in the open, and Elara was slowly, cautiously, adding her own. The first sign of trouble was a gentle, almost apologetic, drip. She was curled in the armchair, a thick novel open on her lap, and a cup of chamomile tea steaming on the small table beside her when she heard it. A soft, plinking sound, out of sync with the patter of the rain that had just begun to fall outside. She frowned, tilting her head. It was a persistent, rhythmic sound. Drip. Pause. Drip. She placed her bookmark carefully between the pages and stood up, following the sound into the small alcove that served as a dining room. There, on the polished surface of the old oak table, a tiny puddle was forming. Elara looked up. A single, fat drop of water clung to the plaster ceiling before letting go, falling to join its brethren below. Another formed in its place. Her heart sank. A leak. Her grandmother had always joked about the cottage's charming eccentricities. But a leak in the face of what the local weather forecast was calling the first real autumn storm felt less charming, and more like a catastrophe in the making. Panic, a cold and familiar visitor, began to prickle at the edges of her calm. In the city, a problem like this was a simple phone call to a building superintendent. Here, surrounded by the untamed beauty of the coast, she was the superintendent. She was entirely on her own. She grabbed a pot from the kitchen and placed it on the table to catch the drops, the sound immediately changing from a delicate plink to a hollow clunk. It sounded much more ominous. She remembered a conversation with Martha, the warm, rosy-cheeked woman who ran the Daily Grind, Port Blossom's only coffee shop. "Anything you need, dearie, just ask," Martha had said, her smile as comforting as the scent of freshly ground coffee beans. This town looks after its own. Elara had only been in town for 3 weeks. She was not sure she qualified as its own just yet, but she was out of options. Pulling on her raincoat, she braced herself against the wind that was now whipping the rain into a frenzy and made the short walk to the town's main street. The daily grind was an oasis of warmth and light. The bell over the door chimed her arrival, and Martha looked up from behind the counter, her brow furrowed with concern. "Elara, honey, you look like you have been wrestling a hurricane," she said, gesturing to Elara's wind-tangled hair and damp coat. "It feels like I might be about to," Elara replied, her voice tight with worry. "Martha, I have a problem. A big one. My roof is leaking." Martha's expression shifted from concern to a knowing sympathy. "Ah, the old Vance cottage. Your grandmother swore that roof had a personality. Said it only cried when it was lonely." She wiped her hands on her apron. "But a storm like this is not the time for personalities. You need Julian. Julian Croft. He is the best there is. Works miracles with wood and nails. He practically rebuilt the pier after the big blow in 2008. If anyone can tame that roof of yours, it is him." She pointed out the window, down the street towards the harbour. "His workshop is the last building on the dock. The big one with the blue door. You cannot miss it. Tell him I sent you. He can be a bit focused." She added, a twinkle in her eye. "But his work is solid as a rock." Elara thanked her profusely, a sliver of hope cutting through her anxiety. She bought a coffee she did not need, just to have a reason to linger in the warmth for a moment longer before venturing back into the worsening weather. The wind was stronger now, carrying the heavy scent of salt and wet earth. It pushed against her as she walked towards the harbour, the masts of the fishing boats clanging a frantic metallic chorus. The workshop was just as Martha had described. A large, weathered building that looked as though it had risen from the sea itself, its blue door a defiant slash of colour against the grey, weathered wood. The windows were lit from within, casting a warm, golden glow onto the wet planks of the dock. As she got closer, she could hear the whine of a power sander, a sound of industry and purpose that was somehow reassuring. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the heavy iron handle. She felt like an intruder, a city girl with a city problem, about to interrupt a man who was clearly in his element. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The sound of the sander stopped abruptly. The air inside was thick with the clean, sharp scent of sawdust and something else, something rich and warm like varnish. Wood shavings littered the floor like fallen leaves. The space was cavernous, dominated by the skeleton of a boat resting in a massive cradle in the centre of the room. It was beautiful, all elegant curves and exposed ribs, a work of art in progress. Standing beside it, sander in hand, was a man who seemed to be carved from the same solid, sturdy material as the boats he built. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his worn flannel shirt. His dark hair was tousled, dusted with fine sawdust that caught the light. He pushed a pair of safety goggles up onto his forehead, revealing eyes the colour of the sea just before a storm, a deep and turbulent grey-green. His face was all strong lines and angles, his jaw tight with concentration, and his expression was one of intense focus, now disrupted by her presence. He looked at her, and for a moment, said nothing. "Can I help you?" he finally asked. His voice was deeper than she expected, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the wooden structure around them. It was not unkind, but it was not exactly welcoming either. It was the voice of a man interrupted. "I am so sorry to bother you," Elara began, feeling small and out of place. "I am Elara Vance. I am living in my grandmother's cottage, Nora Vance's place." His expression softened almost imperceptibly at the mention of her grandmother's name. A flicker of something, recognition, respect, passed through his eyes. "I know the place. Nora was a wonderful woman." "Thank you," she was. Elara clutched her hands together. "The thing is, the roof is leaking. Badly. And with the storm, Martha from the coffee shop said I should find you. She said you were the best." He set the sander down on a workbench cluttered with tools that looked both ancient and well cared for. He ran a hand through his hair, dislodging more sawdust. "A leaky roof in this weather. Of course." He sighed, but it was not a sigh of annoyance. It was one of resignation, of a man who understood the whims of old houses and the fury of the sea. "All right, let me grab my gear. I will follow you over." "Really? Just like that?" Elara was taken aback by his immediate acceptance. He gave her a wry, almost smile. It changed his entire face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "A leak does not wait for an appointment, and your grandmother's cottage deserves better than to be drowned from the inside out." "Give me 5 minutes." He turned away to gather his things, and Elara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. As she waited, her eyes drifted back to the boat. It was a classic design, a sailboat that spoke of grace and speed. "She is beautiful," she said, almost to herself. He turned back, a heavy-duty toolbox in one hand and a roll of tarpaulin under his arm. "She will be. She is a restoration. A 1960s catch. Been in the same family for generations. But she was neglected for the last decade. It is a complete rebuild." He ran a hand along the curved hull with a surprising gentleness, a gesture full of affection and respect. "It must be rewarding," Elara said, "bringing something back to life like that." He looked at her then, a long, searching look that made her feel as though he were seeing more than just a woman with a leaky roof. "It is," he said quietly. "It is the only thing I know how to do." The short walk back to the cottage was a battle against the elements. The wind howled around them, and the rain was now coming down in sheets, blurring the world into a watercolour wash of grey and green. Julian walked with a steady, determined gait, seemingly unbothered by the storm, as if it were an old acquaintance. Elara had to hurry to keep up, her head bowed against the wind. Inside the cottage, the dripping was faster, the clunking in the pot a frantic drumbeat. Julian surveyed the situation with a calm, professional eye. He put his toolbox down with a solid thud and looked up at the ceiling, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said, "all business. I will need to get up on the roof, put a temporary patch in place. It will hold through the storm. Then, when we get a clear day, I will come back and do a proper repair. It looks like some of the shingles have been lifted by the wind over the years." "On the roof?" In this? Elara's eyes widened in alarm. The thought of anyone climbing onto the slippery, wind-lashed roof in the middle of a gale was terrifying. It is not ideal, he admitted, shrugging out of his wet jacket. Underneath, he wore a simple grey t-shirt that fit him in a way that made Elara's breath catch in her throat. But it is better than letting the water in. Do not worry, I have done it before. I know what I am doing. She wanted to protest, to tell him it was too dangerous, but the steady confidence in his voice stopped her. This was his world, his expertise. So she just nodded, feeling useless. Is there anything I can do to help? You can put on some coffee, he said, giving her another one of those small, surprising smiles. A strong, hot coffee would be a good thing to come down to. And with that, he hauled a ladder from his truck, and with the practiced ease of a man completely at home with physical risk, he went out into the storm. Elara watched from the window, her heart in her throat, as he wrestled the ladder into place against the side of the cottage. He moved with a fluid, powerful grace, his body a dark silhouette against the raging grey sky. He climbed up, vanishing over the edge of the roof, and Elara was left alone with the sound of the storm and the frantic beating of her own heart. She made the coffee, her hands trembling slightly. The simple domestic task was a welcome distraction. As the rich aroma filled the small kitchen, she found herself tidying up, plumping cushions, and straightening a pile of books. She was inexplicably nervous, aware of his presence not just on her roof but in her space. It had been a long time since a man had been in her home, and never one like Julian Croft. He was so different from the men she knew in the city, men who worked with keyboards and balance sheets. Julian worked with his hands, with the raw materials of the world. There was an earthiness to him, a solid grounding presence that was both intimidating and deeply comforting. She could hear him moving around above her, the heavy tread of his boots a reassuring sound against the roar of the wind. She wondered about him, about the quiet sadness she thought she saw in his eyes. Martha had said he kept to himself. Why? What was his story? Port Blossom was a small town, and stories were its primary currency. She was sure she would find out eventually. She was not sure how she felt about that. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 20 minutes, the heavy footsteps sounded on the ladder again. The back door opened and he stepped inside, bringing the storm in with him. He was soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his forehead, water dripping from his chin. But he was smiling, a genuine, tired smile. All done, he said, his voice a low rumble. The patch should hold, no more drips. Elara looked at the ceiling. The rhythmic plinking was gone. The only sound was the storm raging outside the cottage walls. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with gratitude. I do not know what I would have done. You have no idea what a relief that is. It is my job, he said, but he seemed pleased by her gratitude. He stood there, dripping on the small rug by the door, looking slightly out of place amongst her grandmother's floral wallpaper and delicate furniture. Here, she said, pressing a warm mug of coffee into his cold hands. You must be freezing. He wrapped his hands around the mug, a look of simple pleasure on his face. This is perfect. Thank you. He took a long sip, his eyes closing for a moment. When he opened them, they met hers over the rim of the mug. The deep grey-green seemed to hold the colour of the sea and the sky all at once. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her feel seen in a way she had not been in a very long time. An unexpected current of warmth flowed through her, chasing away the last of the storm's chill. It was a silent, charged moment, suspended in the cosy air of the cottage. "I will come back in a couple of days, once this all blows over, and we can talk about a permanent fix," he said, his voice a little softer now. "Okay," she managed to say, her own voice barely a whisper. He drained the last of the coffee and placed the mug on the counter. "Well, I should let you get back to your evening." "Wait," she said, wanting to prolong the moment. To keep this solid, reassuring presence in her house for just a little longer. "How much do I owe you?" He shook his head. "We will sort it out when the job is finished. Do not worry about it tonight." He pulled on his still damp jacket and moved to the door. "You stay warm, Elara Vance." He said her name as if he were tasting it, giving it weight and substance. He opened the door, and the storm rushed in to fill the space he was leaving. Then he was gone, and the door clicked shut, leaving Elara alone in the sudden, profound quiet. The cottage was safe, the leak was gone, but the air was still humming with the energy of his presence. She walked over to the window and watched his truck's taillights disappear down the lane. 2 small red sparks, swallowed by the rain and the dark. She raised a hand to her cheek. It was warm. She stood there for a long time, listening to the wind and the waves, the sounds of her new life. But all she could really hear was the echo of his voice saying her name. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and glistening. The sky that dawned the next morning was a pale, fragile blue, and the air, stripped of its humidity, was crisp and cool. For 2 days, Elara existed in a strange state of peaceful limbo. She settled into a routine, exploring the cottage's many quirks, discovering a hidden pantry stocked with her grandmother's preserves, and losing hours in the worn pages of books she had not touched in years. Yet, underneath the quiet surface of her days, there was a thrum of anticipation, a low hum of awareness that Julian Croft would be back. She found herself tidying things that did not need tidying, arranging the collection of sea glass on the mantelpiece and wiping down already clean countertops. She would be reading in her armchair, completely absorbed, when the sound of a truck passing on the main road would make her heart skip a beat. She would glance out the window, a flush of disappointment colouring her cheeks when it was not his familiar, slightly battered pickup. She was annoyed with herself for this adolescent fluttering, this waiting. She had come to Port Blossom to be alone, to heal from a relationship that had taught her the painful lesson of not being enough. She was not looking for a distraction, and certainly not one in the form of a quiet, intense man who smelled of sawdust and the sea. But the memory of his presence, so solid and capable in the face of the storm, had settled into the cottage's atmosphere, a ghost of a different sort than the ones she had left behind in the city. It was on the 3rd morning after the storm that he finally came. The sun was bright, casting long shadows across the lawn. Elara was in the kitchen, nursing a cup of tea and trying to decipher her grandmother's spidery handwriting in a recipe book when she heard the crunch of tyres on the gravel drive. This time, her heart did not just skip. It gave a solid, decisive lurch. She looked through the kitchen window over the sink and saw his truck pull to a stop. He swung himself out of the driver's seat with that same fluid economy of motion she remembered. He was wearing a dark green Henley that stretched across his shoulders and a pair of worn jeans that had faded to a soft blue. The morning sun caught in his dark hair as he went to the back of the truck to unload his tools and a bundle of new shingles. For a moment she just watched him, a man completely at ease in his own skin, his movements sure and purposeful. He was a part of this landscape in a way she could never be. He belonged to the tides, the wind, and the stubborn, resilient houses that dotted the coastline. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed down her sweater and went to open the door, trying to arrange her face into an expression of casual welcome. He was walking toward the house, his arms laden, when he saw her. He stopped and gave a slight nod, his expression as serious as it had been the first day. "Morning," he said, his voice that same low rumble. "Figured I would get an early start. The weather is holding." "Good morning," she replied, her voice sounding a little too bright to her own ears. "It is a beautiful day for it." She stepped aside. "Do you need to come through?" "I just need to get the ladder set up. I will be out of your hair in a few hours." He brushed past her to lean the shingles against the side of the house, and she caught that scent again. Clean wood, salt, and something uniquely him. It was unsettling how a simple scent could feel so distracting. For the next hour, the cottage was filled with the sounds of his work, the scrape of the ladder against the exterior wall, the heavy tread of his boots on the roof above her, the rhythmic, punctuated tapping of his hammer. Each sound was a reminder of his presence, a steady beat against the quiet of her morning. She tried to read, but the words on the page blurred. She tried to answer emails, but her thoughts drifted. The man on her roof was a tangible, unavoidable presence, and Elara found her carefully constructed solitude completely and not unpleasantly shattered. She told herself it was common courtesy. She told herself it was the polite thing to do. She told herself it had nothing to do with the way his smile had crinkled the corners of his eyes, or the memory of how his large, calloused hands had so gently wrapped around the coffee mug she had given him. She made a fresh pot of coffee. She found him sitting on the peak of the roof, his long legs braced on either side, looking out at the ocean. From the ground, he looked like a king surveying his domain. "Julian," she called up, shielding her eyes against the sun. He looked down, his concentration broken. "Everything all right?" I made coffee," she said, feeling suddenly foolish. "I thought you might want a break." He looked surprised. Then that slow, wry smile touched his lips. "You keep saving me with coffee, Elara Vance." He shifted his weight. "Give me a minute. I will come down." She waited for him on the small stone patio at the back of the cottage, setting 2 mugs on the weathered wooden table. He came around the side of the house a few minutes later, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. He had taken off his outer shirt and was just in a plain grey t-shirt now, his arms tanned and corded with muscle. She tried very hard not to stare. "It is a good view from up there," he said, pulling out one of the chairs and sinking into it with a grateful sigh. "I can imagine," she said, pushing a mug towards him. Is the roof okay?" "It will be," he said, taking a sip of coffee. "Your grandmother was smart. She used good materials. The main structure is sound. It was just some wear and tear around the chimney flashing. Another hour and it will be good as new. Better, even." He looked at the cottage with an appreciative eye. She loved this place. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. She did, Elara agreed, a lump forming in her throat. It was her whole world, I think, especially after my grandfather passed. I remember him too, Julian said quietly. He taught me how to tie a bowline knot down on the town dock. Combe. I must have been 7 years old. He had the patience of a saint. Elara smiled, a real, genuine smile. He did. He tried to teach me to fish once. I think I mostly just fed the crabs. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment. The shared memory of her grandparents hanging in the air between them. It was a bridge, a small but sturdy connection in the space that separated their two very different lives. So, he said, breaking the silence. He leaned forward, his forearms resting on his thighs, the coffee mug cradled in his hands. A research librarian. Elara blinked. Martha told you. He nodded. She tells me everything, whether I ask or not. The corner of his mouth twitched. Sounds serious. It is mostly just quiet, she said, shrugging. I find things for people, old documents, forgotten articles, first editions. It is like being a detective, but for information. The past is a lot tidier than the present, sometimes. The words were out before she could stop them. A small, unintended window into her reasons for being here. He seemed to understand. He did not press, did not ask what she meant. He just nodded slowly. I get that. There is a story in old things, in wood especially. He glanced over his shoulder at the cottage. This place has a story. Then his eyes met hers again. The boat I am working on. The Ketch. She was built in 1962, up in Maine. Sailed all the way to the Caribbean and back 3 times. She was at a wedding in Newport. Weathered a hurricane off the coast of Florida. You can feel it when you work on her. You are not just fixing the wood. You are holding the history. Elara was captivated. When he spoke about his work, the guardedness fell away from him. His voice was filled with a passion that was as raw and real as the wood he shaped. That is a beautiful way to think about it, she said softly. It is the only way, he replied, his gaze intense. Otherwise it is just a job, just nails and planks. He finished his coffee and stood up, the spell broken. Well, I should get this finished. He took his mug and hers. Thanks for the coffee. Again. Any time, she said, watching him walk towards the sink in her kitchen to rinse the mugs. It felt so natural, seeing him in her space, that it made her chest ache with a feeling she could not name. He went back to his work, and the rhythmic hammering began once more. Elara stayed outside, curled up in one of the patio chairs with her book. But she was not reading. She was listening to the sounds of him mending her home, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin, and admitting to herself, finally, that she was glad he was here. An hour later, the hammering stopped. She heard his boots on the ladder, then the sound of him loading his tools back into his truck. He came back to the patio, a work invoice in his hand. The transaction felt awkward, clinical, after the moment of connection they had shared. All done, he said. You should not have any more trouble with it. I checked the rest of the shingles while I was up there. Everything else looks solid. Good for another 20 years, I would say. Thank you, Julian, really. She took the invoice from him, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. A tiny spark, a jolt of static electricity, passed between them. She saw his eyes widen almost imperceptibly, and she knew he had felt it too. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her cheeks flushing. She fumbled in her purse for her checkbook, her fingers suddenly clumsy. She wrote out the check, her handwriting shakier than usual. The whole time she was acutely aware of him standing there, watching her. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. "Here," she said, handing him the check. He took it, folding it carefully and tucking it into his pocket without looking at it. "Thanks." He lingered for a moment, as if he wanted to say something else. The silence stretched, filled only by the cry of a distant gull and the soft whisper of the sea. "Well," he said finally, taking a small step back, "I should get back to the shop." "The boat," she said, the word coming out in a rush. "Yeah, the boat." "I would love to see it sometime," she heard herself say. "The progress." His face, which had begun to close off again, relaxed. A genuine smile, bigger than any she had seen from him before, lit up his features. It transformed him. "Yeah?" he said, seeming genuinely pleased. "You should. Stop by any time. I am almost always there." "I will," she promised. "Good." He gave her one last, long look, his sea-storm eyes searching hers. Then he nodded, turned, and walked back to his truck. Elara stood on the patio and watched him drive away until the truck was just a speck on the horizon. She raised her hand to her fingers, the ones that had brushed against his. They were still tingling. The roof was mended. The threat of the storm was gone. But inside her, something new was just beginning to stir. A different kind of storm. One that felt less like a danger and more like a possibility. She looked at her quiet, solitary cottage, her sanctuary. It did not feel quite so empty anymore. It felt like a place where a new story, her story, could finally begin. The promise of sometime hung in the air for the better part of a week. A quiet, unanswered question in Elara's mind. She told herself she was busy. She had books to arrange, a freelance research project to outline, and a whole coastline to explore. She took long walks on the beach, collecting smooth grey stones and tangled pieces of driftwood, arranging them on her windowsill, as if they were words in a sentence she was still trying to form. She visited Martha at the daily grind, learning the names of the fishermen and the local gossip, feeling the slow, gentle rhythm of the town seep into her bones. Port Blossom was beginning to feel less like an escape and more like a destination. But in the quiet moments, in the hush of the evening when the only sound was the distant sigh of the waves, her thoughts invariably drifted down the hill to the harbour, to a big workshop with a blue door. She pictured Julian's hands, strong and sure, moving over the curved wood of the boat. She replayed their conversation, the easy way he had spoken of her grandparents, the passion that lit his face when he talked about his work. He was a puzzle, a man who seemed both deeply rooted and profoundly solitary. She was drawn to that quiet strength, but she was also wary of it. Her last relationship had been with a man who was all smooth surfaces and easy charm, a man who had ultimately proven to have no depth, no anchor. Julian felt like the opposite. He was all anchor, and she was afraid of what it might mean to get caught in his chain. Fear was a powerful current. It had swept her out of her old life and deposited her here, on this remote shore. It was the same fear that made her hesitate now, her hand on the doorknob, her walking shoes already on. She was safe in the cottage, in her solitude. To walk down to that workshop was to risk something. It was to invite complication, to step back into the unpredictable waters of human connection. On Friday, she woke with a new resolve. The sky was a vast, cloudless blue, and the sea was a calm, glittering expanse. It was a day for courage. "It is just a boat," she told herself aloud, the words sounding thin in the quiet of the kitchen. "You are a researcher. It is an object of historical interest." It was a flimsy excuse, a shield of academic curiosity, but it was enough. She put on a simple sundress, a floral print that felt braver than her usual jeans and sweaters, and with her heart beating a little too fast, she walked down the winding lane toward the harbour. The sounds of the workshop reached her before she saw it. The steady rasp of a hand plane, the distant cry of gulls, and the gentle lapping of water against the pilings filled the air. The big blue door was wide open today, spilling a rectangle of golden light onto the dock. She paused at the entrance, peering into the cavernous space. Julian was there, his back to her, bent over a long piece of wood, clamped to a workbench. He was using a hand plane, his movements rhythmic and focused. He shaved off translucent curls of wood that fell like whispers to the floor. The muscles in his back and shoulders moved with a powerful grace under his t-shirt. He was completely absorbed, a man lost in the language of his craft. She was hesitant to break the spell, to interrupt the sacred silence of his concentration. She must have made a sound, a scuff of a shoe or a sharp intake of breath, because he suddenly stopped. He stood perfectly still for a second before straightening up and turning around. His eyes found her in the doorway, and the intense focus on his face softened, replaced by a look of surprise, and then, unmistakably, pleasure. "Elara." He said her name with that same quiet weight as before. He wiped his hands on his jeans, a gesture that seemed endearingly boyish. "You came." "I said I would," she replied, stepping out of the bright sunlight and into the cool, sawdust-scented air of the workshop. "I hope I am not interrupting the slow part." He walked over to the boat, the half-restored ketch that dominated the room, and ran his hand along its hull, a familiar, affectionate gesture. "You wanted to see the progress?" "Yes," she said, her eyes taking in the vessel. More work had been done since she had last seen it. Sections of the hull had been sanded down to a pale, smooth finish, revealing the intricate grain of the wood. It looked less like a skeleton now, and more like a body slowly being brought back to health. "I have been replacing the planks below the waterline," he explained, his voice taking on that passionate, engaged tone she remembered. "Used a process called steam bending. You basically heat the wood in a steam box until it becomes pliable. Then you can shape it to the curve of the hull." He pointed to a long, insulated wooden box in the corner of the shop. "It is an old technique, the best way." He spoke of caulking cotton, marine varnish, and the precise art of fastening bronze screws. Elara listened, fascinated not just by the process, but by the reverence with which he described it. He was not just a builder, he was a historian, a storyteller, preserving the legacy of the craftsmen who had come before him. "My job is mostly about finding the stories that are already written down," she said, thinking aloud. "You are finding the stories in things people have made. You are reading the grain of the wood like a text." He stopped and looked at her, his sea-green eyes full of a new appreciation. I have never thought of it like that. But you are right. That is exactly what it is. He smiled, a full, unguarded smile that made her stomach flutter. Every gouge from a slipped tool, every stain from a leaking cask, they are like marks on a map. They tell you where it has been. He moved closer to the stern of the boat. Here, he said. Let me show you my favourite part. He motioned for her to follow, leading her to the very back of the boat where the tiller was mounted. He ran his hand over the weathered wood of the handle. It was darker than the rest of the boat, worn smooth by decades of hands. Carved into its side was a crude but charming rendering of a compass rose, and below it, a set of initials, TR and SR. Thomas and Sarah Redding, Julian said softly. The original owners. He built this boat for her as a wedding present, sailed it up and down this coast for 40 years together. Their grandson is the one who hired me to restore it. He said his grandfather carved this himself on their maiden voyage. Elara reached out, her fingers tracing the faint lines of the carving. The wood was warm and smooth, almost alive beneath her touch. She could feel the history in it, the faint echo of the hands that had held it, the love that had launched it. She was standing so close to Julian now that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his skin beneath the layers of sawdust and salt. He did not move away. He stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching, both of them looking at the simple carving as if it held a profound secret. The air grew thick and still. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water outside. It felt as if they were in their own private world, a bubble of shared reverence and quiet understanding. Elara was intensely aware of his breathing, of the space between them, a space that felt both too small and too large all at once. She felt a powerful urge to turn her head, to look at him. But she could not. The moment was too fragile. It was Julian who finally broke the spell. He cleared his throat and took a small step back, putting a little more distance between them. The bubble popped, and the sounds of the harbour rushed back in. Anyway, he said, his voice a little rough. That is the story. It is a beautiful one, Elara said quietly, her hand still resting on the tiller. She finally drew it back, her skin tingling where it had touched the wood. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his jeans. So, he said, changing the subject, but his eyes were still soft. How are you settling in? Is Port Blossom treating you well? It is, she said, grateful for the shift. It is quiet, which is what I needed. She looked out the open door at the bright, shimmering water. Everyone has been so kind. Martha keeps trying to feed me scones every time I go in for coffee. He chuckled, a low, warm sound. That is her way. She thinks scones can solve most of the world's problems. They might, Elara said with a smile. I am not ruling it out. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, the earlier intensity having softened into an easy camaraderie, fresh catch, live music. It is a whole thing. Elara's heart gave a hopeful little leap. I think I saw a flyer for that at the post office. Yeah, well, I was thinking of going tonight, and I was wondering. He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. I was wondering if you would want to go. With me. It was not a slick, practiced invitation. It was hesitant, genuine, and somehow all the more appealing for it. This was not a man who played games. He was direct, solid, real. "I would love that," she said. And the relief that washed over his face was so open and sincere it made her smile. "Good," he said, the word coming out on a puff of breath. "That is good. They start serving around 6. I could pick you up. I can just walk down," she offered. "It is no trouble." "No," he said, a little too quickly. "I will pick you up. At 6. The statement was firm, leaving no room for argument. A quiet, old-fashioned courtesy that she found surprisingly touching. "Okay," she said softly. 6 it is. She left the workshop a few minutes later, walking back into the bright afternoon sun feeling dazed, as if she had just surfaced from a deep dive. The world seemed sharper, the colours more vibrant. The scent of the salt spray in the air was intoxicating. She had walked down to the harbour with a flimsy excuse, a shield to protect her fragile peace. She was walking back with a date, a real, actual date. As she climbed the lane back to her grandmother's cottage, a flock of sandpipers took flight from the water's edge, their wings flashing in the sun as they wheeled and soared in perfect unison. She stopped to watch them, a sense of wonder filling her chest. She had come to Port Blossom seeking a quiet harbour, a safe place to mend. She had not expected to find a lighthouse. She was not sure what would happen when she and Julian were together tonight, away from the safe context of leaky roofs and historic boats. All she knew was that for the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker of hope, bright and insistent as a beacon in the dusk, and she was, finally, ready to sail toward it. The hours leading up to 6 o'clock were a strange mixture of giddy excitement and paralysing self-doubt. Elara stood in front of the small wardrobe in her bedroom, staring at her limited selection of clothes as if it were a complex equation she had to solve. Everything she owned seemed to belong to a different woman. There were the severe, tailored blouses and trousers of Elara, the research librarian, a uniform designed for the quiet, anonymous stacks of the university library. Then there were the comfortable, worn-in jeans and oversized sweaters of Elara the hermit, the clothes she had packed for a life of solitude and healing. Neither felt right for tonight. This was not a date, she told herself firmly. It was a local cultural event, an outing, a friendly gesture between a homeowner and the man who had fixed her roof. But her stomach, which was performing a series of impressive acrobatic feats, knew she was lying. Her hands, which trembled slightly as she pushed a hanger back and forth, knew it too. It had been over a year since she had felt this nervous anticipation, this fluttery, hopeful dread. The last time had been with Richard, and that memory was a cold hand on her heart, a reminder of how easily hope could curdle into disappointment. She finally settled on a simple, dark blue dress that fell just to her knees. It was unassuming but elegant, made of a soft material that felt good against her skin. It was a dress she had always liked, but had rarely worn. A dress that felt like a quiet promise to herself. She brushed her hair until it shone, letting it fall naturally over her shoulders, and applied just a touch of makeup, enough to make her feel polished but not like she was trying too hard. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who looked calm. It was a welcome illusion. At precisely 6 o'clock, a firm but gentle knock sounded on the door. Her heart leaped into her throat. She took one last, steadying breath, smoothed the front of her dress, and went to open it. Julian was standing on her doorstep, and for a moment Elara forgot how to breathe. He had changed out of his work clothes and into a pair of dark, well-fitting jeans and a simple, charcoal grey button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The simple clothes somehow highlighted his solid, powerful frame. He had shaved, and his dark hair was still slightly damp, combed back from his forehead. He looked younger, less guarded, and impossibly handsome. He smelled, not of sawdust, but of clean soap and the crisp evening air. He was holding a small jam jar in his hand, filled with a clumsy, charming bouquet of what looked like wildflowers, sprigs of Queen Anne's lace, a few purple asters, and a stalk of goldenrod. He held it out to her, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "These were growing by the side of the road," he said, his voice a little gruff with shyness. I just thought they were nice." Elara's carefully constructed composure melted. The gesture was so simple, so unexpected and achingly sweet, that it disarmed her completely. "Julian, they are beautiful," she said, taking the jar from him. Her fingers brushed against his, and this time the spark was undeniable, a warm jolt that travelled straight up her arm. "Thank you. Let me just put these in some water." She bustled into the kitchen, her mind racing. It was the most romantic gesture she had received in years. Richard had bought her expensive hothouse roses that always felt more like a transaction than a gift. This little jar of weeds felt like a poem. When she came back, he was standing in the middle of her living room, looking at the titles on her bookshelves with an expression of quiet curiosity. "You are ready to go?" he asked, turning to face her. "I am," she said, grabbing a light cardigan from the back of a chair. The drive to the community hall was short, the cab of his truck a small, intimate world. It was immaculately clean, but the faint, lingering scent of sawdust was still there. A familiar and comforting undertone. They made small talk about the weather and the town. The conversation was a little stilted. The air was charged with the nervous energy of a first date. The community hall was a blaze of light and sound. String lights had been hung from the rafters, casting a warm, festive glow over the long wooden tables packed with people. The air was thick with the smells of fried fish, buttered corn, and fresh-baked pies. A local band was set up on a small stage in the corner, playing a lively folk tune that had a few couples dancing. The room was buzzing with the cheerful, chaotic energy of a town coming together. For a moment, Elara felt a wave of anxiety. This was the heart of Port Blossom, a community she was still on the fringes of. She felt like an outsider, an object of curiosity. But then Julian's hand was on the small of her back, a light, reassuring pressure, guiding her through the crowd. "It is a bit of a madhouse," he said, his voice close to her ear so she could hear him over the noise. "But the food is worth it. Come on, let us get a plate before the line gets too long." His presence was an anchor in the swirling sea of people. As they stood in line, several people greeted him with a nod or a friendly slap on the shoulder. He was clearly a known quantity here, a respected, if quiet, member of the community. Elara noticed the glances they received. Curious, friendly, interested. She saw Martha from the coffee shop at a nearby table, who gave them a broad, knowing wink that made Elara blush. They filled their plates with golden pieces of fried haddock, roasted potatoes, and coleslaw, and found a small table for two near the back of the hall, slightly away from the main crush of the crowd. "This is amazing," Elara said, after her first bite of fish. It was flaky and fresh, the batter light and crisp. The fishermen save their best catch for Friday nights, Julian said with a smile. It is a matter of town pride. As they ate, the initial awkwardness began to dissolve, replaced by an easy, flowing conversation. He asked her about her work, and this time she found herself wanting to explain it, to make him understand the quiet thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of piecing together a story from forgotten fragments. It sounds like you are bringing things back to life too, he said thoughtfully, echoing her own observation about his work. Just a different kind. I suppose I am, she said, surprised he had made the connection. I never thought of it that way. So what brought you here? He asked, his gaze direct but gentle. To Port Blossom. I know your grandmother's cottage, but it is a long way from the city. Elara hesitated, the familiar knot of pain tightening in her chest. She could give him the easy answer, the one she gave everyone else. A change of pace, a quiet place to work. But looking into his steady, patient eyes, she felt the urge to offer him a piece of the truth. I needed a quiet place to mend, she said, the word tasting strange on her tongue. I was in a relationship for a long time. It ended, and the city started to feel like it was haunted. Too many memories. He did not offer platitudes or easy reassurances. He just nodded, his expression full of a quiet understanding that was more comforting than any words could have been. Ghosts can be loud, he said simply. The quiet empathy in his voice made her feel safe. What about you? She asked, wanting to steer the conversation away from her own bruised heart. Martha said you grew up here. Did you ever think about leaving? He looked out at the crowded room, a complex expression on his face. I did. When I was 18, I could not wait to leave. This town felt like a cage. I went to college for a couple of years, down in Boston. I studied engineering. What happened? She asked, intrigued by this glimpse into his past. My dad got sick, he said, his voice dropping a little. Cancer. He ran the boatyard, just like his father before him. It was his whole life. I came home to help out for a summer, and I just never left. He died that winter. The business was in trouble. My mum needed me. Leaving did not feel like an option anymore. He shrugged, as if it were a simple thing. But Elara could hear the weight of the story beneath the words, the sacrifice, the love. I am so sorry, Julian, she said softly. It was a long time ago, he said, but he did not meet her eyes. And the truth is, after a while, the cage started to feel like home again. I realized this is where I belong. I like the quiet. I like working with my hands. I like knowing that the work I do matters to people here. It is a good life. He finally looked at her, his eyes clear and direct. It is a simple life. Just then, the band shifted gears, the lively folk tune replaced by a slow melodic ballad. A fiddle sang a sweet, mournful melody over the gentle strumming of a guitar. The couples on the dance floor paired off, swaying together in the warm light. Julian cleared his throat, a flicker of nervousness returning to his eyes. Do you, would you like to dance? Elara's heart did a little flip. I am not a very good dancer, she confessed. That makes two of us, he said, a wry smile touching his lips as he stood up and held out his hand. We can be bad at it together. She took his hand. It was warm and strong, his calloused palm enveloping hers. He led her onto the small dance floor, and the moment he pulled her gently into his arms, the rest of the room faded away. He placed one hand on her waist, and she rested her other hand on his shoulder. They moved together slowly, awkwardly at first, then found a rhythm. He was so much taller than her. She found the perfect place to rest. Her head was against his chest, just below his shoulder. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. She could feel the warmth of his body, the strength in the arm that held her. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him. In his arms, surrounded by the sweet, sad music, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, completely and utterly safe. He did not speak. He just held her, swaying gently to the music. It was a more intimate conversation than any they could have had with words. It was a conversation of trust, of comfort, of a quiet, growing connection that was taking root in the space between them. When the song ended, they stood for a moment without moving, reluctant to break the spell. He slowly loosened his hold, his hand sliding from her waist to her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "Let us get some air," he said, his voice a low murmur. He led her out a side door and away from the noise of the hall, down a grassy slope to the edge of the water. The moon was a bright silver sliver in the inky sky, laying a shimmering path across the calm surface of the harbour. The air was cool and smelled of salt and low tide. They stood in silence for a long time, their hands still linked, watching the moonlight on the water. "Thank you for tonight," Elara said softly, breaking the quiet. "I had a really wonderful time." "Me too," he said, turning to face her. In the pale moonlight, his eyes were deep pools of shadow. "I am glad you came to Port Blossom, Elara Vance." He lifted his free hand and gently tucked a strand of hair, loosened by the sea breeze, behind her ear. His fingers were warm against her skin, and his touch was feather-light, sending a shiver down her spine. He let his hand linger for a second, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. She looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. He was so close, she could see the flecks of green in his grey eyes. He leaned in, and she knew, with a dizzying certainty, that he was going to kiss her. Her eyes fluttered shut in anticipation, but the kiss never came. She felt the soft brush of his lips against her forehead, a gesture of such profound tenderness that it made her heart ache. He pulled back slowly, his hand dropping from her face, but not letting go of her other hand. "I should get you home," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she could not quite decipher. The walk back to the truck and the drive back to the cottage were wrapped in a thick, charged silence. It was not an awkward silence anymore. It was a silence filled with unspoken things, with the lingering touch of his lips on her skin, with the promise of what was to come. He walked her to her door, the little porch light casting a soft glow around them. "I would like to see you again," he said, his voice low and serious. "If you would like that." "I would like that very much," she whispered. He squeezed her hand once, a final reassuring pressure. "Good night, Elara." "Good night, Julian." He turned and walked away, his tall frame disappearing into the darkness. Elara opened her door and stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. She leaned against it, her eyes closed, and raised her fingers to her forehead, where the ghost of his kiss still lingered. The cottage was quiet, her sanctuary, but it no longer felt like a place to hide. It felt like a place to begin. The days that followed the fish fry unfolded like the pages of a beloved book, each one revealing a new and wonderful chapter in her connection with Julian. The tentative, fragile thread that had formed between them began to weave itself into a strong, resilient cord. They fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as the turning of the tides. He would work at his shop during the day, and she would write and research at the cottage. But their evenings belonged to each other. Sometimes he would come up the hill to the cottage, bringing fresh fish he had bought off the docks, and they would cook together in her grandmother's cosy kitchen, their bodies brushing past each other in the small space, each touch sending a jolt of warm electric awareness through her. Other times, she would walk down to the harbour as the sun began to set, the sky streaked with pink and gold, and sit on a stool in his workshop, watching him work, listening to the soothing rasp of sandpaper on wood as they talked about everything and nothing. He taught her how to identify the different types of wood by their grain and scent. She read him passages from the books she was reading, her voice a soft murmur against the backdrop of the lapping waves. They took long walks on the beach at dusk, their bare feet sinking into the cool, damp sand, their hands clasped together. It was on one of these walks, with the moon rising over the dark, shimmering water and the salty wind whipping her hair across her face, that he stopped, turned to her, and finally kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion or sudden explosive desire. It was as quiet and sure as the man himself. His calloused hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, and he simply looked at her for a long moment, his sea storm eyes full of an emotion so deep it made her breath catch. Then he lowered his head, and his lips met hers, softly at first, a question, and then with a growing certainty as she melted into him, her hands coming up to rest on his strong chest. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and wood smoke and a profound sense of coming home. It was a kiss that sealed the unspoken promise that had been growing between them. In Julian's arms, Elara felt the last of her old ghosts begin to recede. The sharp, painful edges of her memories of Richard started to soften and blur. The gnawing feeling of not being enough, a feeling that had been her constant companion for years, was replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. Julian saw her. He listened to her. He valued her thoughts, celebrated her quiet nature, and looked at her as if she were the most fascinating person in the world. He was not trying to change her or fix her. He was simply letting her be, and in that unconditional acceptance, she began to heal. She started to feel like herself again, or rather like a new, stronger version of herself she was only just beginning to discover. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the fish fry, she was curled in her armchair, lost in a 19th century manuscript, when the sound of an unfamiliar car engine broke the coastal quiet. It was not Julian's rumbling truck or the mail carrier's familiar rattle. This was a sleek, expensive sound, the purr of a luxury sedan, utterly out of place on the gravel drive of her grandmother's rustic cottage. Curious, she got up and peered out the window. A silver BMW was parked behind her own modest car. A man was getting out of the driver's side. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored blazer and expensive-looking jeans. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled blonde hair, his movements smooth and confident. Elara's blood ran cold. The manuscript slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. It was Richard. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. A wave of nausea washed over her. What was he doing here? How had he found her? It felt like a violation, an invasion of the sanctuary she had so carefully built. This place, this life, was hers. He had no right to be here. She stood frozen, hidden behind the curtain, as he walked up to her front door. He looked around at the cottage, a small, dismissive smile on his lips. The kind of smile he reserved for things he considered quaint, but ultimately beneath him. Then he knocked on the door, a sharp, impatient rap that echoed the sudden panic in her chest. For a wild moment, she considered not answering. She could hide, pretend she was not home, and wait for him to go away. But what then? He knew where she was now. He would not just give up. Steeling herself, she took a deep, shaky breath, walked to the door, and opened it. He looked surprised to see her, as if he had half expected a stranger to answer. Then his face broke into the familiar, charming smile that had once made her heart turn over. Now, it just looked predatory. "Elara," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "There you are. I was beginning to worry. You disappeared without a word." "Richard," she said, her own voice tight and strained. "What are you doing here?" "I came to find you, of course," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He tried to step inside, but she held her ground, blocking the doorway. "Can I come in?" It was a long drive. "How did you find me?" she asked, ignoring his question. "It was not easy," he admitted, his smile wavering slightly at her coldness. "Your roommate was surprisingly loyal, but your mother, well, she just wants what is best for you. She wants you to come home." Rage, hot and sharp, flared in Elara's chest. He had gone to her mother, manipulating her, twisting the situation to his advantage. "You have no right," she said, her voice trembling. "I have every right," he countered, his charm beginning to fray, revealing the hard edge of entitlement beneath. "Elara, we were together for 5 years. You do not just throw that away. I know you were upset. I know I made a mistake." "A mistake," she repeated, the word tasting like poison. "You had an affair, Richard. For 6 months. That is not a mistake. That is a choice, a series of choices." "It was stupid, meaningless," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "It is over. I ended it. I want you back. I miss you." He reached for her, but she flinched away, taking a step back into the cottage. He took her retreat as an invitation and followed her inside, closing the door behind him. The small living room seemed to shrink with his presence. He filled it with his expensive cologne and his restless, urban energy. He looked around, his gaze lingering on the worn furniture, the sea glass on the mantel, the stack of books by her chair. "This is where you have been hiding?" he asked, a note of condescension in his voice. "It is rustic." He picked up one of her grandmother's hand-thrown pottery mugs. "What are you playing at, Ellie?" "Little House on the Prairie." It was a cute little break, but it is time to come back to reality. "This is my reality," she said, finding a sliver of strength. "This is my home." "It is a vacation," he shot back. "You cannot seriously mean to stay here, in this forgotten little fishing village. What do you even do all day?" "Talk to seagulls," His words were designed to hurt, to make her feel small and foolish. And a year ago, they would have tapped right into her deepest insecurities. But as he spoke, something shifted inside Elara. She was not just hearing his condescension. She was seeing the man himself, stripped of all his charm, and he was small. His world was small, defined by money and status, and what other people thought. Her world, here, in this quiet cottage, felt vast. It held the sea and the sky, and a kind of peace he could never understand. "I am happy here," she said, her voice growing stronger, clearer. "Happy," he scoffed, laughing a humorless laugh. "Come on, Ellie, do not be dramatic. You are not happy, you are hiding. I am here to take you home." Just then, the sound of an approaching engine cut through the tense silence. Julian's truck. Elara's heart seized with a new kind of panic. She was supposed to meet him. They were going to walk down to the docks and watch the fishing boats come in. The thought of Julian and Richard in the same room was like imagining two different worlds colliding. The truck pulled into the drive and the engine cut out. Richard glanced out the window. "Who is that?" "The local lumberjack," he asked with a sneer. Elara's face burned with anger. Before she could answer, a knock sounded on the door. It was Julian's knock. Solid, steady, patient. She ran to the door and threw it open. He was standing there, a soft smile on his face, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Ready to go," he started to say, but then he saw her expression. The tear tracks on her cheeks she had not even realized were there. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of deep concern. He looked past her, into the cottage, and his eyes landed on Richard. Julian's face did not change, but Elara saw a stillness come over him, a quiet hardening of his features. He did not look angry or threatened. He just looked solid, an immovable object. "Elara," he said, his voice a low question, his eyes searching hers. "This is none of your business, pal," Richard said, stepping forward, trying to position himself between them, to claim ownership of the space, of her. "We are in the middle of a private conversation." Julian did not even look at him. His gaze remained fixed on Elara. "Are you okay?" he asked her. It was the question that broke her. In that simple, quiet inquiry, she heard all the care and respect that had been missing from her life for so long. She saw the choice laid out before her with painful clarity. On one side was Richard, with his smooth words and his hollow promises, a man who wanted to own her. On the other hand was Julian, with his quiet strength and his steady heart, a man who only wanted to see her safe and happy. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. A single tear rolled down her cheek. That was all Julian needed to hear. He took a deliberate step into the cottage, placing himself between Elara and Richard. He was not physically threatening, but his presence seemed to suck the air out of the room. He was a mountain. Richard, for all his tailored clothes and city confidence, suddenly looked flimsy and insubstantial. "I think you should leave," Julian said to Richard. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but it held a core of steel. Richard laughed. A nervous, arrogant sound. You have got to be kidding me. Who the hell are you? I am the man telling you to leave, Julian replied, his voice unwavering. Ellie, are you going to let this fisherman talk to me like that? Richard demanded, turning to her, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. And that was it. The last thread of her past snapped. She stepped out from behind Julian, her back straight, her head held high. Do not call me Ellie, she said, her voice shaking but clear as a bell. My name is Elara, and this is my home. And he is not a fisherman. He is the kindest, most decent man I have ever met. And you are trespassing. I want you to leave. Now. Richard stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He did not recognize the woman standing in front of him. The timid, eager to please girl he had molded and controlled was gone. In her place was a stranger with fire in her eyes. He looked from her resolute face to Julian's immovable calm. He was outnumbered, defeated. With a final, venomous glare, he turned on his heel, brushed past Julian, and stormed out of the cottage, slamming the door behind him. A few seconds later, the sound of his powerful engine roared to life, spitting gravel as he sped away. The silence he left behind was profound. Elara stood in the middle of the room, trembling from head to toe, the adrenaline and emotion of the confrontation crashing over her in a tidal wave. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold. Julian did not move. He just stood there, watching her, giving her a moment to breathe. Then, slowly, he walked over to her. He did not speak. He just opened his arms. She collapsed against him, burying her face in his chest, and finally let the sobs come. Great, shuddering waves of grief and relief, and release. She was crying for the years she had wasted, for the pain she had endured, and for the sheer, terrifying, exhilarating freedom of finally letting it all go. He held her, his strong arms a safe harbour in the storm. He stroked her hair, his hand firm and steady, and murmured quiet, soothing things against her ear. He just held her, weathering the storm with her, until the last of her tears were spent, and she was left limp and exhausted in his arms. He gently led her to the armchair and sat her down, then disappeared into the kitchen. He came back a few minutes later with a mug of tea, sweetened just the way she liked it. He knelt in front of her and placed it in her shaking hands, his own hands closing over hers, warming them. You were brave, he said softly, his eyes full of a fierce, proud tenderness that made her heart ache. That was the bravest thing I have ever seen. She looked at him, at his kind, honest face, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was finally, truly, safe. The last of the ghosts had been face down on her shore, and they had vanished with the tide. The storm was over. He was still there. The minutes after Richard's car sped away stretched into a vast, quiet space. The air in the cottage, once charged with his abrasive energy, slowly settled, cleansed by the ensuing silence. Elara sat curled in the armchair, the warm mug of tea, a small anchor in the lingering swell of adrenaline. Julian did not press her to talk. He simply pulled up the small wooden stool from her writing desk, sat opposite her, and waited. His presence was a steady, unassuming comfort, a quiet promise that she was not alone. She took a sip of tea, the sweetness a small, welcome shock. She looked at Julian, at the patient concern etched around his eyes and the gentle set of his mouth. He deserved an explanation. More than that, she wanted to give him one. She wanted to unburden herself of the last, toxic remnants of her past, so there would be nothing left between them but clear, open air. He and I were together for 5 years, she began, her voice low but steady. The trembling had finally stopped. My life in the city, it was really his life. I just lived in it. His friends, his restaurants, his ambitions. I was a supporting character in the story of him. She looked down into her mug, watching the steam curl and vanish. He was a professor at the university, in the business school. Very charismatic, very successful. Everyone adored him. And he made me feel like I was lucky to be chosen. He had this way of making his criticism sound like helpful advice. My clothes were too plain, my interests too obscure, my quietness a social liability. He was always trying to polish me, to make me into a better accessory for his life. And the worst part is, I let him. I thought that is what love was, sanding yourself down to fit someone else's expectations. Julian listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on her, his expression a mixture of empathy and a quiet, simmering anger on her behalf. When I found out about the affair, she continued, it was the betrayal. Of course, but it was more than that. It was the final, irrefutable proof that I had never been enough. That all that sanding and polishing had been for nothing. I was not just heartbroken. I was erased. So I ran. I came here to hide, to find a place where no one had any expectations of me at all. She finally lifted her eyes to meet his. I did not expect to find you. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. He was not seeing you, Elara, he said, his voice a low, fierce rumble. He was seeing a reflection of himself. He did not want a partner. He wanted a mirror. Anyone who spends 5 minutes with you knows how wrong he was. He squeezed her hand. You are not too quiet. Your quiet is a beautiful thing. It is where you think and notice things no one else does. Your interests are not obscure. They are fascinating. You taught me to see the stories in the wood I work with every day. And you are not plain. You are like the sea on a clear day. You think it is simple at first, just one colour. But the longer you look, the more you see. All the different shades of blue and green, the light, the depth. It is endless. Tears welled in Elara's eyes, but these were not the hot, painful tears of before. These were tears of profound, healing relief. To be seen, truly and completely seen, was a gift she had never known. I was hiding too, in my own way, he admitted, his gaze shifting for a moment to the dark window, to the reflection of the cozy room against the night. After my dad died, I poured everything I had into this business, into his legacy. It became my whole world. It is a good world, a good life. But it was solitary. I did not realize how solitary it was until I met you, until I fixed your roof and you made me tea and talked to me about books. You brought a different kind of light into my world, a warmth I had forgotten I was missing. He looked back at her, his sea-green eyes holding hers, raw and open. When you walked into my workshop that first day, it was like someone opened a door I did not even know was closed. And when I saw that man here tonight, looking at you with that ownership in his eyes, I understood what it was to be truly afraid. Not for me. For you. For the thought of this light being taken away. The space between them was no longer just clear air. It was alive, humming with everything they had just shared. The last walls around Elara's heart crumbled into dust. She knew, with a certainty that resonated in her very soul, what she felt for this man. The fear was gone, replaced by a love so clear and strong it felt like the bedrock of the earth itself. "I am not going anywhere," she whispered. "This cottage, this town. It is not a hiding place anymore. It is my home." A slow, beautiful smile spread across Julian's face, a sunrise after a long night. "I was hoping you would say that." She set her tea down and leaned forward, her free hand coming up to rest on his stubbled cheek. "No, I know," she said, her voice soft but sure. "I love you, Julian Croft." His smile deepened, and he let out a short, soft breath, a sound of pure happiness. He covered her hand with his own, pressing it against his face. "I love you, Elara Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think I have since the day you stood on your porch in the rain and told me my roofing estimate was thoroughly detailed." She laughed, a real, bubbling laugh that felt like a release. He leaned in and kissed her, and this kiss was different from all the others. It was a kiss of homecoming, of declaration, of two solitary worlds merging into one. It was a kiss that held the quiet promise of 1,000 shared sunrises. They did not do much for the rest of that evening. He built a fire in the hearth, and they sat on the floor in front of it, wrapped in one of her grandmother's old quilts, her back resting against his chest, his arms securely around her. They watched the flames dance, their comfortable silence a language all its own. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound and cleansing calm. He left late, with a final, lingering kiss at the door that promised a new beginning. Elara slept more deeply that night than she had in years, a dreamless, peaceful sleep. She woke just before dawn, the sky outside her window a pale, pearlescent grey. A sudden impulse, clear and bright, seized her. She dressed quickly, pulling on a warm sweater and her boots, and slipped out of the cottage. The air was cold and clean, smelling of damp earth and salt. Instead of turning left to walk on the beach, she turned right, her feet finding the familiar path down the lane to the harbour. She did not know if he would be there, but she felt drawn to his workshop, to the place where their story had truly begun. A single light was on inside. The big blue door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside. He was there, standing beside the starlight, a mug of coffee in his hand, looking at the boat as if in quiet contemplation. He turned as she entered, a look of mild surprise melting into a warm, welcoming smile. "You are up early," he said. "So are you," she replied, walking over to him. He handed her his mug, and she took a sip. The coffee was hot and strong. "I could not sleep," he admitted. "Too much to think about." "Good things, I hope," she said, handing the mug back. "The best," he said softly. He set the mug down on a workbench and took her hand. "Come here." There is something I want you to see." He led her not to the boat, but to a large, cleared space on the far wall of the workshop. Tacked to the wall were several large sheets of paper, covered in precise, hand-drawn lines, angles and calculations. They were blueprints. "What is this?" she asked, looking at the intricate drawings. It was a boat, a smaller one than the ketch, but elegant and beautifully proportioned. "It is a design I have been working on for years," he said, his voice full of a quiet passion. "My own boat. Not a restoration, but something new, built from scratch. I work on it when I have time, in between other jobs. It has been a slow process." He pointed to the name carefully lettered across the transom in the drawing. It read, "The North Star. For finding your way home," Elara whispered, understanding instantly. "Exactly," he said, his eyes shining. "I always thought of it as a solitary project, something I would sail alone one day. But last night and this morning, I was looking at the plans, and I realized they are incomplete." He picked up a pencil from the workbench, its point worn and smooth. He moved to the drawing of the boat's small, cozy cabin. With a few sure, swift strokes, he altered the design. He widened a single bunk into a double. He added a second reading lamp. And next to the small, built-in bookshelf, he drew another larger one, filling almost an entire wall. He stepped back and looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "It needs more room for books," he said simply. Elara looked from the altered blueprint to his hopeful, loving face. This was not just a drawing of a boat. It was a drawing of a future with room for her, a future they would build together. She stepped into his arms, wrapping hers around his neck, and pulled his face down to hers. "It is perfect," she whispered against his lips. As they kissed, the first rays of the rising sun streamed through the workshop's high, dusty windows, bathing them and the half-finished boat and the plans for their future in a clean, golden light. It was the light of a new day. It was the light of home. The following spring arrived in Port Blossom not as a delicate whisper, but as a joyous, salt-scrubbed shout. Daffodils pushed their way through the soil along the lane to the cottage, and the days grew longer, stretching out into luminous, golden evenings. The world felt new, washed clean and brimming with promise, and Elara's life had been reborn along with it. The cottage was no longer a sanctuary of solitude, but a shared home, filled with the comfortable, overlapping rhythms of two lives. Julian's heavy work boots now sat permanently by the door next to her walking shoes. His charcoal sketches of boat designs were tacked to the wall above her writing desk. Her books had overflowed their shelves and migrated to the workshop, where Julian had built a special, dust-proof cabinet for them. Their life was a quiet, seamless dance between the world of words and the world of wood. Elara's research project on the seafaring wives of New England had taken on a life of its own. What had started as a refuge from her own pain had become a source of profound passion and connection. She spent hours in the small-town archives and talking to the descendants of the families she was studying, her quiet, patient nature drawing out stories that had been tucked away for generations. She was no longer an outsider looking in. She was becoming part of the town's living history, a weaver of its forgotten threads. One bright Saturday in May, the air warm with the promise of summer, Elara was in the workshop, a fine layer of sawdust covering her jeans. She was carefully applying a coat of varnish to a small, intricately carved wooden box Julian had made. Her strokes long and even. This had become one of her favourite ways to spend an afternoon, working alongside him in a comfortable silence, punctuated by the rasp of his tools and the soft lap of the tide against the pilings outside. He was standing at his workbench, planing a long piece of cedar that was destined to become part of the cabin of the North Star. The boat was taking shape in the centre of the workshop, its skeleton strong and elegant, a testament to his skill and patience. Watching his hands move over the wood with such reverence and certainty still made her heart ache with a quiet, happy wonder. "You are getting good at that," he said, not looking up from his work, the muscles in his back moving smoothly under his thin cotton shirt. "I have a good teacher," she replied, smiling. She dipped her brush back into the pot of varnish, the scent of it sharp and clean. "Besides, I think I missed my calling." Elara Vance, professional varnisher. It has a nice ring to it. He chuckled, a low, warm sound. He set down his plane and came over to inspect her work, his large frame casting a warm shadow over her. He leaned in close, his arm brushing against hers, and the familiar, pleasant jolt of his touch went through her. "Perfect," he murmured, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. "No drips, no streaks. You are a natural." He did not move away but stayed there, his presence a comforting weight beside her. He looked from the box to her face, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You seem happy here, Elara." "I am," she said, her voice soft. She looked around the workshop, at the organised chaos of his tools, at the proud, curving ribs of the boat they were building, at the sunlight streaming through the high windows, illuminating the dancing dust motes. "I am happier than I ever thought I could be." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, sawdust-flavoured kiss that was full of the easy, profound intimacy they had built. "Good," he said against her lips. "That is all I ever want." He straightened up, a new energy in his movements. "All right, varnisher. Clean your brushes. The tide is right, and there is somewhere I want to take you." A little while later, they were walking hand in hand down the dock, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. But instead of turning towards the beach or the path to town, he led her to the mooring where the starlight bobbed gently on the water. The old ketch was gleaming, her restored wood glowing with a deep, rich lustre. Her sails were neatly furled, her brass fittings polished to a brilliant shine. She was no longer a wounded ghost of the past, but a proud, beautiful vessel, ready for the sea. "What are we doing?" Elara asked, a thrill of anticipation running through her. "The engine is tuned, the rigging is tested, and the hull is sound," he said, a proud smile on his face. He hopped aboard with practiced ease and then held out a hand to her. "I would say she is ready for her maiden voyage, or her second maiden voyage, and I cannot think of anyone I would rather have for my first mate." Her heart swelled. She took his hand and let him help her onto the deck. It felt like stepping into a dream. He had poured so much of himself into this boat, into bringing it back to life, and he was sharing this moment, this victory, with her. Together they unfurled the sails. Julian moved with a quiet, confident grace, his hands sure on the lines, and he showed her what to do, his instructions calm and clear. Soon the great canvas sails billowed out, catching the steady onshore breeze with a satisfying snap. Julian cast off the mooring lines, and with a gentle lurch, the Starlight pulled away from the dock and out into the wide, open harbour. It was glorious. The boat cut cleanly through the water, the only sounds the creak of the ropes, the whisper of the wind in the sails, and the rush of the sea along the hull. The town of Port Blossom slowly receded, the familiar cluster of houses and docks becoming a miniature landscape nestled against the green hills. Out here, with the vast expanse of the blue ocean ahead and the endless sky above, Elara felt a sense of freedom so profound it was almost dizzying. Julian stood at the helm, his hand resting lightly on the tiller, his face turned to the wind, a look of deep, peaceful contentment in his eyes. He looked like he was a part of the sea itself, as elemental and steady as the tides. He looked over at her, and his smile was as bright as the sun glinting on the water. He steered them around the headland and into a small, secluded cove she had never seen before, its shores lined with weathered granite and wind-stunted pines. He dropped anchor in the calm, turquoise water, and the sails came down with a soft rustle. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the cry of a distant gull and the gentle slap of water against the boat. "It is beautiful here," Elara breathed, looking at the pristine, untouched shoreline. "My favourite place," he said, coming to stand beside her at the rail. He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into his strength, resting her head on his shoulder. They stood like that for a long time, simply watching the light change on the water. "When I was a boy," he said finally, his voice a low murmur against her ear, "I used to come out here in my father's little skiff. I would sit right here and dream of all the places I would go, all the adventures I would have. When he died, and I took over the boatyard, I stopped coming here. I guess I stopped dreaming." He turned her gently in his arms to face him. He took both of her hands in his gaze serious and full of a deep, unwavering love. "And then you came along, Elara," he said softly. "You walked out of the rain and into my life, and you taught me how to dream again. You taught me that home is not a place you are tied to. It is the person you navigate your life with. It is the one point on the compass that always stays true, no matter how stormy the seas get." He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, flat object. It was not a box. It was a piece of wood, the same dark, rich mahogany he had used for the boat's trim, sanded and polished until it felt like silk. In the centre, inlaid with a delicate sliver of light-coloured maple, was a perfectly rendered compass rose. He turned it over in his hand. On the back, he had carved 2 words: "My North." Tears filled Elara's eyes as she looked from the beautiful, handcrafted compass to his earnest face. "I am not a man of fancy words," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I do not have much to offer besides my 2 hands and my heart. But they are both yours, completely, if you will have them. I want to build a life with you, Elara. I want to fill that boat," he nodded towards the shore, towards the workshop, "with books and laughter and all of your quiet, wonderful thoughts. Well, I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. Will you marry me?" Will you be my true north? She could not speak. She could only nod, tears of pure, unadulterated joy streaming down her face. She threw her arms around his neck, and he lifted her off her feet, swinging her around in a circle on the deck of the reborn boat, his triumphant laugh echoing across the quiet water. He set her down and kissed her, a deep, searching kiss, filled with all the love and promises in the world. When he finally pulled back, he slipped a simple woven cord over her head. The wooden compass came to rest in the hollow of her throat, warm against her skin. It was more beautiful and precious than any diamond. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, they stood together on the deck of the Starlight, arms wrapped around each other, and looked out at the endless sea. The journey had been long, and the waters had been rough, but they had found their harbour. This was a tale of two hearts finding their way to each other, a story of how the quietest love can become the compass that guides you for the rest of your life. It was not an ending, but the true and beautiful beginning of everything.